High in the Colorado Rockies, the village of Pine Hollow had written off the old Mackenzie cabin as a lost cause. The 100-year-old structure had collapsed under last winter's brutal storms, its hand-hewn logs scattered like broken bones across the mountainside. The town council voted to clear the debris and move on. Then Eli arrived. Nobody knew where the quiet 18-year-old came from. He appeared one morning with calloused hands, ancient woodworking tools, and eyes that seemed to hold generations of mountain wisdom. While the village slept, Eli worked. Night after night, the sound of his hammer echoed through the pines. What the townspeople discovered 3 months later defied explanation. The cabin didn't just stand, it seemed to breathe with life. Every joint was perfect, every beam positioned with impossible precision. But it was what Eli had hidden inside the walls that made the village elders weep and the young people dream again. How could one boy possess knowledge that had been lost for over a century? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first person to notice Eli was Martha Henley, Pine Hollow's unofficial town historian and self-appointed guardian of local affairs. She'd been making her usual morning trek to the general store when she spotted him crouched beside the ruins of the Mackenzie place, running his fingers along a weathered beam as if reading Braille. "Excuse me," she called out, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. "This is private property." The young man looked up, and Martha found herself momentarily speechless. His eyes were an unusual shade of green, almost silver in the early light, and they held a gravity that seemed impossible for someone barely out of boyhood. "I know," he said simply. "I spoke with the town council. Mayor Davidson gave me permission to salvage what I could." Martha frowned. She attended every council meeting religiously, and she'd heard no such discussion. Salvage for what purpose? To rebuild it. The old woman let out a short laugh. "Son, half the logs are rotted through, and the other half are split beyond repair. The foundation stones have shifted, and the whole thing's been picked clean by scavengers. There's nothing here worth saving." Eli stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. He was taller than she'd initially thought, with the lean build of someone accustomed to hard work. "There's always something worth saving, Mrs. Henley. You just have to know where to look." She blinked in surprise. She hadn't told him her name. Over the following days, word of the strange young man spread through Pine Hollow's 112 residents like smoke through timber. Some claimed he'd been seen hauling massive logs down from the high country before dawn, logs that should have taken a team of men and heavy equipment to move. Others swore they'd watched him shape timber with hand tools that looked like museum pieces, working with a speed and precision that defied belief. Mayor Davidson, a pragmatic man in his 60s, decided to investigate for himself. He found Eli one evening as the sun was setting behind the peaks, carefully fitting a foundation stone into place with nothing but a pry bar and what appeared to be an encyclopedic understanding of leverage and physics. "I don't recall authorizing any construction project," Davidson said, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. Eli didn't look up from his work. "You authorized salvage rights. This is salvage. Looks more like construction to me." "Same thing, really. Taking what's broken, making it whole again." He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the evening chill. "The Mackenzie family built something special here, Mayor. Your town's history shouldn't disappear just because of one bad winter." Davidson studied the young man's face in the fading light. There was something familiar about him, though he couldn't place what. "How do you know about the Mackenzies?" "That family left Pine Hollow before the Second World War." "People leave," Eli said quietly. "Stories remain." As autumn deepened into winter, the sounds from the old Mackenzie site became part of Pine Hollow's nightly rhythm. The methodical thunk of an axe, the rasp of a hand plane, the gentle tap of wooden pegs being driven home. Children would sneak close enough to catch glimpses of Eli working by lantern light, his breath steaming as he bent massive timbers to his will through techniques their grandfathers might have recognized but could no longer name. Then one morning in December, The sounds stopped. The silence felt wrong to everyone who'd grown accustomed to the night music of construction. By noon, a small crowd had gathered at the base of the hill, staring up through the snow-laden pines at what stood where ruins had been just 3 months before. The cabin rose from its foundation, like something from a half-remembered dream. Its logs fitted so perfectly they seemed to have grown that way. Smoke curled from a stone chimney that hadn't existed the day before, and warm light glowed from windows that reflected the mountain peaks with startling clarity. But Eli was nowhere to be seen. The coffee at Millie's diner had gone cold an hour ago, but Sarah Chen hadn't noticed. She sat in the corner booth, the same one where her grandmother used to hold court every Tuesday morning, staring through rain-streaked windows at the impossible sight across the valley. The Blackwood cabin stood whole, not just standing, gleaming. Even through the October drizzle, she could see fresh timber gleaming golden against the dark pines, smoke curling from a chimney that had collapsed before she was born. Her architectural training told her what she was seeing defied logic. 3 days ago, that structure had been nothing but rotted beams and broken dreams. "More coffee, honey?" Millie's voice cut through her thoughts. Sarah shook her head, unable to look away from the cabin. "Millie, how many people saw him working up there?" The older woman slid into the opposite seat with a grunt, her arthritic knees protesting. At 73, Millie Hendricks had served coffee to 3 generations of Pine Ridge residents and claimed to know everyone's business before they did. That's just it. Nobody saw much of anything. Tommy Martinez delivered supplies Tuesday and Wednesday, said the young man was polite enough, paid in cash, but didn't offer his name. Worked with his shirt off despite the cold. Tommy said he'd never seen anyone move like that with timber. "What do you mean?" Millie's eyes crinkled, like he was dancing with it instead of wrestling it. "And the sounds—" She paused, glancing around the nearly empty diner. Old Pete nursed his usual hangover coffee at the counter, and the Brennan twins shared pancakes by the door, but Millie still lowered her voice. Folks up on Ridge Road said they heard singing, in a language nobody recognized. Sarah finally turned from the window. As the village's only resident with architectural experience, she'd been the one to officially condemn the Blackwood property 5 years ago. The foundation had been compromised, the roof completely gone, and 60 years of harsh mountain winters had rotted the supporting beams beyond salvation. The cost to rebuild would have been astronomical, even if someone could have transported proper equipment up that treacherous mountain path. "I need to see it up close. Sarah, honey." "No, I'm serious. This is impossible. No one person rebuilds a structure like that in 3 days, not without heavy machinery, not without a crew, and certainly not without permits." She grabbed her jacket from the booth. "Something's not right here." The drive up to Blackwood Ridge took 20 minutes on a good day. Today, with the rain turning the dirt road into a muddy obstacle course, Sarah's Honda Civic struggled with every switchback. She'd made this drive dozens of times over the years, first as a child when her grandmother would bring offerings to old Marcus Blackwood, later as a teenager when the cabin became a dare among local kids, and finally as a professional when the county asked her to assess the property after Marcus's death. She knew every tree, every rock formation, every twist in the path, which made what she saw when she finally reached the clearing all the more unsettling. The cabin looked like it had been lifted from a master craftsman's portfolio. The logs fit together with Japanese precision, the chinking between them applied with an artistry that spoke of old-world techniques. The roof, which she clearly remembered seeing caved in just days before, now displayed hand-split cedar shakes arranged in perfect overlapping rows. Solar panels, definitely not original to the 1920s structure, had been integrated so seamlessly they looked like they belonged. But it was the foundation that made her knees weak. The Blackwood cabin had always sat on a stone foundation that had been slowly failing for decades. Sarah's report had specifically noted how the southeastern corner had sunk nearly 2 feet, creating structural damage that would have required complete reconstruction. Now, Massive granite blocks formed a level, square base that looked like it had been laid by master masons. Where had stones that size even come from? The nearest quarry was 3 hours away, and there was no way to get equipment up here to move them. Sarah walked slowly around the perimeter, her trained eye cataloguing impossibilities. The electrical meter was new but showed no connection to the county grid. The water spigot on the north side suggested plumbing, but the property had never been connected to municipal water. Most unsettling of all were the details that had nothing to do with construction. The herb garden laid out in a complex geometric pattern, the wind chimes that sang in languages her ear couldn't quite catch, and the symbols carved into the doorframe that definitely weren't from any building tradition she'd studied. Standing there in the drizzle, staring at craftsmanship that belonged in architectural magazines, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The absolute certainty that the world contained mysteries her education couldn't explain. The question now was whether she had the courage to knock on that perfect door and ask for answers. From inside the cabin came the sound of someone humming, the same impossible melody the wind chimes had been echoing. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer when Sarah Chen made her way up the winding path to the old Hartwell cabin. As the village's part-time journalist for the county paper, she'd convinced herself this was legitimate news, a human interest story about restoration and community spirit. But truthfully, curiosity had been gnawing at her since she'd first glimpsed the stranger 3 weeks ago. What she found stopped her in her tracks. The cabin stood transformed, its weathered logs gleaming with fresh chinking, the sagging roof now perfectly aligned. But it wasn't just the structural restoration that made her breath catch. It was the details. Hand-carved shutters bore intricate mountain laurel patterns that seemed to dance in the shifting light. The porch railings displayed delicate spiral work that spoke of old-world craftsmanship. Most striking of all was the front door, a masterpiece of joinery featuring an elaborate compass rose that appeared to be cut from a single piece of dark walnut. Beautiful work, isn't it? Sarah spun around to find the stranger emerging from behind the cabin, carrying an armload of split wood. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps early 30s, with calloused hands that moved with practiced economy. His dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and his clothes, well-worn flannel and canvas work pants, suggested someone comfortable with physical labor. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I write for the Mountain Echo. I was hoping to speak with you about the restoration." He set down the wood carefully, each piece placed with deliberation. "Marcus," he said simply, accepting her handshake. His grip was firm but brief, though I'm not sure there's much of a story here. "Are you kidding?" Sarah gestured toward the cabin. "Everyone in Pine Ridge said this place was beyond saving. The Hartwell family abandoned it in the 20s after the mining operation collapsed. How did you even know about it?" Something flickered across Marcus's face, so quickly she almost missed it. "Sometimes places find you," he said, turning back toward the cabin. "Would you like to see inside?" The interior took Sarah's breath away. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a mantel carved from what appeared to be a single beam of chestnut. The floors gleamed with a warm patina that spoke of careful restoration rather than replacement. Built-in shelving lined one wall, each shelf perfectly level, the wood grain matching seamlessly. But it was the windows that truly amazed her. Where the originals had been broken and boarded over, Marcus had installed new ones that seemed to capture and concentrate the mountain light, flooding the space with a golden warmth that made everything glow. "How long have you been working on this?" Sarah asked, running her fingers along a windowsill that felt smooth as silk. "Time moves differently up here," Marcus replied, lighting kindling in the fireplace with movements that suggested long practice. "I suppose that's part of why I chose this place. Where did you come from? What's your background in restoration work?" The question seemed to make him uncomfortable. He poked at the growing fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "I've done various things, traveled quite a bit, learned from people who knew the old ways." Sarah sensed evasion but pressed gently. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. That compass rose on the front door. I've never seen anything like it." "My grandfather taught me woodworking," Marcus said, and for the first time, his voice carried real warmth. He believed that everything you create should honor both the material and the purpose. "Is he still—" "No." The word carried finality. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire catch hold. Sarah noticed details that spoke of someone planning to stay: cast-iron cooking pots hanging from hand-forged hooks, shelves stocked with preserved goods, a reading chair positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. "The village is talking," she said carefully. "People are curious about you, about why someone with your skills would choose a place like Pine Ridge." Marcus turned from the fire, and Sarah caught something in his expression. Not quite sadness, but a deep weariness that seemed older than his years. "Sometimes a person needs to disappear for a while," he said quietly, "to remember who they are underneath everything else." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp crack echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, the sound of a branch breaking under weight. Marcus's entire demeanor changed instantly. His casual stance became alert, his eyes scanning the tree line visible through the windows. "Probably just a deer," Sarah said, but Marcus shook his head slightly. "Deer don't move like that," he murmured, moving to the window. After a long moment, he seemed to relax marginally. "I should probably get back to work. Daylight's precious this time of year." Sarah recognized a dismissal when she heard one, but as she gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd witnessed something significant in that moment of watchfulness. Whatever Marcus was hiding from, or running toward, it was bigger than a simple desire for solitude. The morning after the storm brought an eerie quiet to Pine Hollow, broken only by the steady rhythm of hammering that had become as familiar as the mountain wind itself. Sarah adjusted her binoculars and peered through the kitchen window toward the cabin site, where Eli worked, despite the mud and debris scattered by the previous night's tempest. "He's been at it since dawn," she murmured to her coffee cup, watching him move with that same unhurried precision that had captivated the village for weeks. But something was different today. Where yesterday there had been a foundation and scattered timber, now stood the skeletal frame of an entire structure, its bones gleaming with fresh-hewn wood. The impossibility of it gnawed at her. No one worked that fast, especially not alone, especially not in a storm that had knocked out power lines and flooded half the main road. Behind her, footsteps creaked on the old floorboards. "Still spying on our mysterious carpenter?" Her mother's voice carried a note of gentle teasing, but Sarah caught the underlying concern. "Mom, look at this." Sarah stepped aside, offering the binoculars. "Yesterday that was just a foundation. Today it's this." Margaret Chen took the binoculars with skeptical hands, then fell silent as she focused on the distant construction site. When she finally lowered them, her expression had shifted from amusement to something closer to unease. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I know." They stood together in silence, watching Eli's distant figure move between the wooden beams like he was conducting some ancient dance. Other villagers had begun to notice too. Old Henrik stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, staring openly. Mrs. Patterson had abandoned her morning garden routine to peer over her fence. Even the usually indifferent teenagers clustered at the bus stop kept glancing toward the construction site instead of their phones. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling her notebook from her jacket pocket. "I've been tracking the materials." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Tracking them how?" "The lumber deliveries, the shipments, everything that's come into the village for the past month." Sarah flipped through pages covered in her careful handwriting. "Based on what I've recorded, there shouldn't be enough materials for what he's building. The quantities don't match." Margaret frowned. Maybe he had supplies delivered elsewhere? Where? The old logging road's been washed out for 3 years, and we'd notice if trucks were coming through the main road. Everything has to pass right through the village center. They watched Eli climb to the peak of the frame, moving with a confidence that suggested he'd done this countless times before. As he worked, the morning sun caught something metallic at his neck, a pendant or chain that caught the light with each movement. "I'm going over there," Sarah announced, closing her notebook with a snap. "Sarah, no, let the man work in peace." But her daughter was already reaching for her jacket. "Mom, what if he's in some kind of trouble? What if that's why he won't talk to anyone, why he's so secretive about everything?" Margaret caught her arm gently. "Or what if his privacy is exactly what he needs? Some people come to places like Pine Hollow to escape things, honey. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them." Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob. Through the window, she could see that Eli had stopped working and was looking directly at their house. Even at this distance, she felt the weight of his gaze, as if he knew exactly what they'd been discussing. "He's looking at us," she breathed. Margaret moved to the window. Indeed, Eli stood motionless on the cabin frame, his attention fixed on their kitchen window. Then he raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning before returning to his work. "That's unsettling," Margaret admitted. The phone rang, making them both jump. Sarah grabbed it, grateful for the distraction. "Hello? Sarah? It's Tom Bradley down at the post office." His voice carried an odd tension. "You might want to come down here. There's something you need to see." "What kind of something?" "Better if you see it yourself. It's about our mysterious friend up at the cabin." "And Sarah? You might want to bring your camera." She hung up, her pulse quickening. "Mom, I need to go to the post office." "What's wrong?" "I don't know yet." Sarah grabbed her digital camera and notebook. But Tom sounded strange. As she headed for the door, she cast one more glance toward the cabin site. Eli had vanished from view, but the sound of construction continued, that steady rhythm that had become the heartbeat of their small village. Whatever Tom had discovered, she suspected it would only deepen the mystery surrounding the man who had appeared in their lives like a character from one of her unfinished stories. The morning air carried the scent of rain and sawdust as she hurried toward whatever revelation awaited her at the post office. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer threads as Elena made her way up the familiar path, a thermos of coffee and plate of warm biscuits balanced in her hands. She'd been making this trek for 3 days now, ever since she'd first encountered the stranger working on the old Hartwell place. Each morning brought new impossibilities. Yesterday, she'd discovered he'd somehow restored the cabin's stone chimney to pristine condition, complete with intricate mortar work that would have taken a master mason weeks to complete. As she crested the ridge, the sight that greeted her stopped her cold. The cabin's roof, which had been a collapsed ruin of rotted beams and missing shingles just 24 hours earlier, now boasted a perfect crown of hand-split cedar shakes. Steam rose from the chimney and warm yellow light spilled from windows that shouldn't have existed. The originals had been shattered beyond repair decades ago. "Impossible," she whispered, setting down her offerings on a nearby stump. The mathematical precision of it gnawed at her. She'd calculated the lumber requirements herself. Replacing that roof should have taken a crew of 4 men at least 2 weeks, assuming they had access to proper equipment and materials. Yet here it stood, completed in a single night. The cabin door opened before she could knock, and the stranger emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth that looked suspiciously clean for someone who'd supposedly been working with wood stain and sealants. Up close she noticed details that had escaped her before. His clothes, while simple, showed no signs of the wear she'd expect from heavy construction work. His boots, though practical, bore none of the scuffs and stains that should have accumulated from days of labor. "Elena," he said, and she realized with a start that she'd never told him her name. "Thank you for the coffee, and the company." "How did you—" she began, then shook her head. "Never mind. I'm more interested in how you accomplished this." She gestured toward the roof. "That's a 48-hour job, minimum, even with a full crew." Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "You know construction?" "I know mathematics, and physics, and the limitations of human endurance. She crossed her arms. What I'm looking at violates all three. For a long moment he studied her with those unsettling grey eyes. Then he stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin's interior. Would you like to see what I'm really working on? Elena hesitated. Every rational instinct screamed warnings. Isolated location, mysterious stranger, too many unanswered questions. But curiosity, her lifelong weakness, proved stronger than caution. She stepped across the threshold and immediately understood why he'd been reluctant to show her. The cabin's interior was impossibly spacious, far larger than the external dimensions could accommodate. Where she'd expected a single room, corridors stretched deeper into what should have been solid mountainside. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a faint, warm luminescence that had nothing to do with the oil lamps scattered throughout. And everywhere, carved into every available surface, were symbols, not random decorations, but precise mathematical sequences that made her pulse quicken with recognition. My God, she breathed, moving toward the nearest wall. These are equations, geometric proofs. But the notation system. She traced one symbol with her fingertip, feeling it warm under her touch. This is centuries ahead of anything in current mathematical literature. You recognize the principles? His voice carried a note she couldn't identify, hope, perhaps, or relief. Some of them. This section here, it's describing spatial relationships, but in dimensions beyond our normal three. And this? She paused at a particularly complex sequence. This looks like it's calculating probability matrices across multiple timeline variables, which should be impossible, because we don't have the mathematical framework to even conceptualize temporal mechanics. What if I told you that the framework exists but hasn't been discovered yet? Elena's hand stilled against the wall. I'd say you're either insane or you're not who you claim to be. I've never claimed to be anyone. The simple truth of that statement hit her like cold water. In 3 days of conversation, he'd deflected every personal question, never offered a name, never explained his presence. She'd been so focused on the impossibility of his construction work that she'd missed the more fundamental impossibility of his existence. "Who are you?" she whispered. Before he could answer, voices echoed from outside, multiple voices, agitated and growing closer. Through the window, Elena saw torch beams cutting through the morning mist, a search party moving with the determined urgency of people who'd reached the end of their patience with mysteries. "They're looking for answers," the stranger said quietly, watching the approaching lights. "The question is whether they're ready for the truth." Elena looked from the impossible interior of the cabin to the approaching villagers, understanding with crystalline clarity that whatever happened in the next few minutes would irrevocably alter the quiet rhythm of their mountain community. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud as Elena made her way up the winding path to the cabin. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the stranger's cryptic words and the inexplicable transformation she'd witnessed. The coffee in her thermos had long since grown cold, but she clutched it anyway, needing something tangible to anchor her to reality. As she crested the final ridge, the cabin came into view, and she stopped dead in her tracks. Yesterday's impossible restoration now seemed almost mundane compared to what lay before her. The entire clearing had been transformed overnight. Where once there had been overgrown weeds and fallen logs, now stood a meticulously organized workspace. Lumber was stacked in perfect geometric patterns, tools arranged with military precision on makeshift tables, and, most unsettling of all, the cabin itself seemed to shimmer in the early light as if it were somehow more real than everything around it. The young man emerged from behind the structure, carrying what appeared to be a beam of wood that should have required 3 people to lift. He moved with fluid grace, setting it down without the slightest strain. When he noticed Elena standing at the tree line, he raised a hand in greeting, as if her presence at dawn was the most natural thing in the world. "You're early," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I wasn't expecting anyone for another hour." Elena forced her feet to move, approaching slowly. "I couldn't sleep." I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about this place choosing you. She gestured at the transformed clearing. And about how you could possibly have done all this in one night. He set down the tools he'd been carrying and studied her with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. You want answers. I want to understand. This cabin has been falling apart for decades. My grandfather used to bring me here when I was little, told me stories about the family that built it, the Harpers. They disappeared one winter, just vanished without a trace. No one's been able to make heads or tails of what happened to them, and no one's been able to restore what they left behind. The young man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Tell me about these stories. Elena found herself recounting her grandfather's tales, how the Harper family had been master craftsmen, how they'd built not just this cabin, but half the original structures in the village below, how they'd seemed to have an almost supernatural understanding of the mountain's moods and seasons, how they'd disappeared during the worst blizzard in living memory, leaving behind only mysteries and gradually crumbling monuments to their skill. As she spoke, the stranger moved around the cabin's exterior, running his hands along the restored walls with an intimacy that suggested deep familiarity. His fingers traced the joints between logs, paused at certain carved symbols Elena hadn't noticed before, lingered on the perfectly fitted cornerstones. Your grandfather was a wise man, he said finally. He understood that some stories carry more than just entertainment value. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, the young man disappeared around the cabin's far corner. Elena heard the sound of something heavy being moved. Then he reappeared carrying a wooden chest that looked as old as the cabin itself. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and flow in the dancing light. I found this yesterday, buried beneath the back foundation. He set the chest down carefully. It was sealed with materials that should have rotted away decades ago, but they were perfectly preserved. Elena approached the chest with growing unease. The carvings were unlike anything she'd seen before, not quite Native American, not quite European, but somehow incorporating elements of both traditions. As she looked closer, she realized some of the symbols matched those carved into the cabin's beams. Have you opened it? I was waiting. For what? For someone who belonged here. His gaze met hers. Your family has deep roots in this place, doesn't it? Deeper than just your grandfather's stories. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. My great-great-grandmother was born in the village. She was one of the few who remembered the Harpers personally. She paused, a memory surfacing. She used to say they weren't like other people, that they knew things, old things. The young man nodded slowly. And what did she say happened to them? She claimed they didn't disappear in the blizzard. She said they left because they had to, because something was coming that they couldn't face, something that would destroy everything they'd built if they stayed. For a long moment, the clearing fell silent except for the distant call of morning birds and the whisper of wind through pine branches. The young man's hands rested on the chest's carved lid, and Elena could see something like sorrow in his expression. Perhaps, he said quietly, it's time to find out if she was right. The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke on Tuesday morning, sending sheets of rain across the valley and turning the mountain paths into rushing streams. Most of the village hunkered down indoors, but Elena found herself drawn to her kitchen window, watching the distant cabin through the grey curtain of weather. Even from here she could see the warm glow emanating from its windows, steady and inviting despite the chaos outside. The sight stirred something restless in her chest. She'd been thinking about Thomas constantly since their conversation 3 days ago, replaying his words about the cabin choosing its keeper. There had been something in his eyes when he'd said it, a weight that spoke of deeper truths. By afternoon, the rain had gentled to a steady drizzle. Elena pulled on her raincoat and boots, telling herself she was simply checking on a neighbor. The path to the cabin was treacherous with mud and fallen branches, but she pressed on, driven by a curiosity that had grown beyond mere concern. She found Thomas on the covered porch, carefully arranging what appeared to be old photographs on a weathered table. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck again by how his presence seemed to calm the very air around him. "Elena." His smile was genuine, if somewhat guarded. "Brave of you to venture out in this weather. I wanted to make sure you were all right. The storms up here can be fierce." She gestured toward the photographs. "I hope I'm not interrupting something important." Thomas glanced down at the images spread before him, his expression growing distant. "Just organizing some family history. Would you like to come in? I just made coffee." Inside, the cabin's transformation continued to amaze her. The space felt larger somehow, as if the walls themselves had expanded to accommodate not just furniture, but possibility. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that looked both ancient and well-loved. A stone fireplace crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across hand-hewn beams that gleamed with fresh care. But it was the photographs scattered across the kitchen table that drew her attention. Black and white images of people in period clothing, some formal portraits, others candid shots of daily life. And there, in the center of the collection, was a photograph that made her breath catch. "That's the cabin," she said, moving closer. "But it looks new," Thomas finished quietly. "That was taken in 1924, just after it was completed. The man standing in the doorway was my great-grandfather, Jonas Whitmore." Elena studied the image more carefully. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Thomas, the same strong jaw, the same thoughtful eyes. But there was something else about the photo that nagged at her, some detail her mind couldn't quite grasp. "Your family built this place?" Thomas nodded, settling into a chair across from her. Jonas was what you might call a craftsman-philosopher. He believed that buildings could hold memory, that they could store the essence of the lives lived within them. He designed this cabin according to very specific principles. "What kind of principles?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of another photograph. "Have you ever noticed how some places just feel right? How you can walk into a room and immediately feel at peace, or energized, or inspired?" Jonas believed that was no accident. He thought that with the right materials, the right proportions, the right intentions, you could create spaces that actively improved the lives of those who inhabited them. Elena found herself leaning forward, captivated despite herself. "And you believe that?" "I've seen it work." His voice carried absolute conviction. "This cabin isn't just restored, Elena. It's awakened. Every beam, every stone, every joint was crafted with purpose. The proportions follow mathematical sequences found in nature. The materials were chosen for their resonant properties. Even the location was selected for its unique geological characteristics. Thunder rolled across the valley, but inside the cabin the sound felt muffled and distant. Elena realized she'd been sitting here for nearly an hour, and despite the storm raging outside, she felt more relaxed than she had in months. "I can feel it," she admitted softly. "There's something about this place. It's like coming home," Thomas finished, even for the first time. Their eyes met across the table, and Elena felt that same electric awareness she'd experienced during their first conversation. But now it was accompanied by something deeper, a sense of recognition that went beyond the merely physical. "Why are you really here, Thomas? In our village, I mean. There must be other cabins, other projects that would pay better." Thomas gathered the photograph slowly, his movements deliberate. "Some things choose you," he said finally. "The cabin, the place, the people. You can fight it, go looking for what you think you want elsewhere. But eventually, you learn to recognize when you've found where you belong." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but Elena found herself in no hurry to leave. The morning mist clung to the valley like a secret reluctant to be told. Sarah found herself walking the familiar path to the cabin before dawn, drawn by something she couldn't name. Her grandmother's journal, tucked safely in her jacket pocket, seemed to pulse with each step. She wasn't surprised to find Elias already awake, sitting on the newly rebuilt porch with a steaming cup of coffee. What did surprise her was the way he looked up when she approached, as if he'd been expecting her all along. You couldn't sleep either, he said, not really a question. Sarah pulled the journal from her pocket, its leather cover warm from her body heat. I found something. About the original cabin, about why it was built here. She hesitated, studying his face in the grey pre-dawn light. But I think you already know, don't you? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the journal. Then he stood, setting his coffee aside. Come inside. There are things I need to show you. The interior of the cabin had been transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been rotting floorboards and crumbling walls, now stood a space that seemed to breathe with purpose. But it was the walls that made Sarah's breath catch. Carved into the wood with intricate precision were symbols, diagrams, and what looked like maps of underground passages. Your great-grandfather wasn't just a craftsman, Elias said, running his fingers along one of the carved walls. He was a guardian. This cabin was built to protect something that's been hidden beneath this mountain for over a century. Sarah opened the journal, her hands trembling slightly. The entries near the end, they mentioned keeping the trust and protecting what sleeps below. I thought it was just the rambling of an old man, but you were wrong. Elias moved to what appeared to be a solid section of floor and pressed his palm against a specific pattern in the wood. With a soft grinding sound, a section slid away, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Your family has been guarding one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North America, a pre-Columbian settlement that predates anything historians thought possible. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's impossible. There's never been any evidence of advanced civilization in this region before European contact. Evidence can be hidden when it challenges too many accepted truths, Elias replied. Your great-grandfather understood that. So did his father before him. The knowledge was passed down through generations. But when your grandfather moved away, the chain was broken. Sarah descended the first few steps, peering into the darkness below. A faint current of air carried unfamiliar scents, earth and mineral, and something else, something ancient. How do you know all this? Who are you really? My name is Elias Montague. I'm an archaeologist, but not the kind you'd find in any university. I work for an organization that specializes in protecting sites like this one from exploitation. He pulled out a small flashlight, its beam revealing more carved stone walls below. We've been monitoring this location for decades, waiting for the right time to ensure its preservation. Monitoring? Sarah's voice echoed slightly in the underground space. You mean watching us? Watching our family? Protecting, Elias corrected. There are others who know about this place, people who would destroy it for profit or twist its significance for their own purposes. Your great-grandfather's cabin was the perfect cover, and his family the perfect guardians. But when the cabin began to fail, and no one came forward with the knowledge, you decided to rebuild it yourself. Understanding dawned on Sarah. That's why you came here. That's why you knew exactly how to restore it. They had reached the bottom of the steps now, and Elias's flashlight revealed a vast underground chamber. Ancient stone walls rose around them, covered in pictographs and symbols that seemed to dance in the moving light. The space felt alive, pregnant with stories waiting to be told. The settlement dates back at least 800 years, Elias explained, his voice hushed with reverence. It represents a level of sophistication that would rewrite our understanding of pre-contact civilizations. But more than that, it contains astronomical calculations and mathematical concepts that suggest contact with other advanced cultures. Sarah moved closer to one of the walls, her fingers hovering just above the carved symbols. This is why the village has been struggling, isn't it? People leaving, opportunities drying up. You've been keeping everyone away. Not me, Elias said quietly. The site itself has a way of protecting itself. People who don't belong here find reasons to leave, but those who are meant to be guardians, he looked at her meaningfully, they find their way back. Above them, the first rays of sunrise were beginning to filter through the cabin windows, casting long shadows down the stone steps. Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about her family, her heritage, and her purpose in this forgotten corner of the world had just changed forever. The storm arrived without warning, as mountain storms often do, transforming the peaceful evening into a fury of wind and rain that sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as lightning illuminated the valley in stark, violent flashes, each one revealing the cabin on the ridge, standing impossibly steady against the gale. She should have been worried about her own roof, about the loose shingles Tom had promised to fix last spring. Instead, she found herself pulling on her raincoat and boots, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name. The logical part of her mind screamed that venturing out in this weather was madness, but something stronger pulled her toward the mountain path. The wind nearly knocked her sideways as she left her porch, rain stinging her face like needles. The familiar trail had become a treacherous maze of mud and fallen branches, but she pressed on, using her flashlight to navigate the increasingly hostile terrain. Each step forward felt like a battle, yet she couldn't turn back. She finally reached the cabin. She found the door standing open, warm light spilling out into the storm as if in invitation. She hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of how presumptuous her arrival must seem, but another crack of thunder decided for her, pushing her inside. Marcus stood at the far window, his silhouette perfectly still against the chaos outside. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't seem surprised by her presence, as if he had been expecting her all along. "The storm," she began, then stopped, realizing how inadequate words seemed in this moment. "It's not just a storm," he said quietly, still facing the window. "Look at the lightning." Sarah moved closer, studying the electrical display outside. At first, she saw only the random violence of nature, but as her eyes adjusted, patterns began to emerge. The strikes weren't random at all. They were following specific paths, creating a web of light that seemed to center on their exact location. "That's impossible," she whispered. Marcus finally turned, and in the lamplight, his face held an expression of deep sadness mixed with resignation. "I should have left before this happened. I thought I had more time." "Time for what?" "Marcus, what's happening?" He moved to the restored fireplace, running his hand along the stone mantel with the same careful attention he'd shown every inch of the cabin's reconstruction. "This place? It's not just old, Sarah. It's a marker, a beacon. And by fixing it, I've activated something that's been dormant for nearly a century." The wind howled harder, and Sarah could swear she heard voices in its fury, not the random sounds that imagination creates from natural chaos, but actual words in a language she didn't recognize. The cabin's walls began to emit a faint luminescence, as if the very wood and stone were responding to some unseen energy. "The original builder," Marcus continued, his voice barely audible above the storm. "He wasn't just a settler looking for land. He was running from something, hiding something. The cabin was designed as a prison as much as a home." Sarah's flashlight flickered and died, but the growing luminescence from the walls provided enough light to see by. She watched in fascination and growing fear as symbols began to appear on the restored surfaces, carved into the wood, etched into the stone, emerging like invisible ink exposed to heat. "You're him," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her with startling clarity. "Not his descendant. You're actually him." Marcus met her eyes, and she saw confirmation in his expression before he spoke. "Thomas Blackwood. I built this place in 1847 to contain something I brought with me from the old country, something I thought I could control, or at least keep from harming others." The storm reached a crescendo, and the entire cabin shuddered. Through the windows, Sarah could see lights moving in the forest, not the random dance of lightning, but purposeful, seeking illuminations that swept through the trees like searchlights. "But you restored it too well," she realized. "You made it too strong." "I couldn't help myself. After so many years of watching it decay, of seeing what I'd built crumbling to nothing, I had to make it whole again. But the repairs didn't just restore the prison. They strengthened what was trapped inside." The lights in the forest were growing closer, and with them came sounds that no earthly storm could produce. a harmonious humming that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones, calling to something primitive and terrified in her mind. "What do we do?" she asked. Marcus moved to a section of wall where the symbols glowed brightest, pressing his palm against the surface. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah could feel the presence of something vast and ancient, stirring beneath the cabin's foundations. "We finish what I started a century ago," he said, "but this time we do it right." Outside, the first of the lights broke through the tree line, revealing shapes that Sarah's mind struggled to process, forms that seemed to shift between states of matter like living geometry made manifest. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain across the mountain and forcing everyone indoors. Everyone except Elena, who found herself standing at her kitchen window, watching the mysterious glow emanating from the direction of the old cabin. Even through the downpour, she could see light pulsing rhythmically through the trees, like a heartbeat made visible. She'd tried to sleep, but the questions that had been building for weeks refused to quiet. The young man's impossible knowledge of their family histories, the way animals seemed drawn to him, and most disturbing of all, the fact that her grandmother's journal contained sketches of someone who looked exactly like him, dated 60 years ago. Lightning illuminated the forest path as Elena pulled on her rain jacket. She had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting whatever impossibility waited in those woods. The cabin appeared different in the storm, somehow larger and more substantial than before. Light spilled from every window, warm and golden, and she could hear the sound of hammering despite the late hour. As she approached the front door, it swung open before she could knock. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Water dripped from her jacket onto floors that gleamed like they'd been polished by decades of careful attention, rather than hastily rebuilt in mere weeks. The interior took her breath away. The cabin wasn't just restored, it was transformed into something that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Hand-carved furniture that looked both ancient and newly made filled the space. Books lined shelves that stretched to the ceiling, their leather spines bearing titles in languages she couldn't identify. And everywhere, covering every surface, were detailed maps and sketches of the village and its people spanning what appeared to be generations. "Who are you?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the roof. He moved to the fireplace, where flames danced without any visible fuel. "I'm someone who's been searching for a home for a very long time, and I'm someone who owes your family a debt I've never been able to repay." Elena's eyes fell on a particular sketch pinned to the wall near the fireplace. It showed her grandmother as a young woman, but not alone. Beside her stood a man who could have been the stranger's twin, and they were both smiling at something beyond the frame. "That's impossible," she breathed, moving closer to examine the drawing. The detail was extraordinary, every line of her grandmother's face exactly as Elena remembered from old photographs, but captured with an intimacy that suggested the artist had known her well. "Your grandmother saved my life once," he said quietly. "During the winter of 1962, when the avalanche cut the village off for 3 months. I was injured, lost, and she found me. She and a few others nursed me back to health, asked no questions, demanded nothing in return. When spring came, I had to leave. I promised her I'd return someday to repay the kindness." Elena turned to face him, her mind reeling. "But that would make you—" "Much older than I appear, yes." He met her eyes steadily. "I know how it sounds. I know what you must be thinking. But your grandmother believed, and she made me promise that when I returned, I'd help the village however I could." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief silence that followed, Elena heard something else. Voices, faint but distinct, coming from deeper in the cabin. She looked toward the back rooms, confusion evident on her face. "The others will arrive soon," he said, following her gaze. "Thomas is already here, and Sarah's on her way. They deserve to know the truth as well. Your families were the ones who helped me, and your families are the ones who'll need to decide what happens next." "Decide what?" Before he could answer, the door opened again, and Thomas stumbled in, shaking rain from his coat. Behind him came Sarah, then old Henrik from the general store, each of them wearing the same expression of bewildered determination that Elena felt. "The light," Thomas said simply. "We all saw the light." "And we all have questions," Sarah added, her eyes already taking in the impossible details of the transformed cabin. Henrik moved slowly to one of the sketches on the wall, his weathered hand trembling as he reached toward it. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside a woman Elena didn't recognize. "My Anna," Henrik whispered. "She died in the avalanche, trying to help." He turned to look at the stranger with tears in his eyes. "She died, trying to help you." The stranger nodded gravely. "I've carried that weight for 60 years. I've spent that time learning, growing stronger, searching for a way to honor what was lost and protect what remains. This village, your families, you represent something precious that's disappearing from the world." Outside, the storm intensified, but inside the impossible cabin, 5 people sat down to hear a story that would change everything they thought they knew about the world, about their village, and about the mysterious young man who had chosen their forgotten corner of the mountains for reasons none of them could have imagined. The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke just after midnight, bringing with it winds that howled through the valley like something alive and angry. Maya woke to the sound of branches scraping against her window and the distant crash of what sounded like a tree falling somewhere in the darkness. She lay still for a moment, listening to the fury outside, when another sound caught her attention, voices carried on the wind, urgent and alarmed. Wrapping herself in her father's old coat, she stepped onto the porch and peered through the driving rain toward the center of town. Lights were moving down by the old bridge, flashlight beams dancing frantically in the storm. Maya grabbed her own flashlight and rain boots, pulling on both as she hurried down the muddy path toward the commotion. The creek had swollen to nearly 3 times its normal size, brown water churning and roiling as it rushed beneath the wooden bridge that connected the 2 halves of their small community. But it wasn't just the water that had drawn people from their beds. The bridge itself was groaning ominously, its supports straining against the current. "It's not going to hold," Tom Brewster was shouting over the wind to anyone who would listen. "We need to get everyone to higher ground. If that bridge goes, half the town will be cut off." Maya counted maybe a dozen people huddled in rain gear, their faces grim in the wavering flashlight beams. Mrs. Chen was there with her grandson, both of them looking terrified. The Kowalski family had ventured out as well, baby Anna crying in her mother's arms as they tried to shield her from the rain. "Where's Marcus?" Maya found herself asking, though she wasn't sure she'd spoken aloud until Tom turned to her. "Haven't seen him," Tom replied, his voice tight with worry. "Probably holed up in that cabin of his. Smart man, this is no night to be out." But even as he said it, Maya felt a strange certainty that Marcus wouldn't simply wait out the storm while others were in danger. She turned toward the path that led up to the old cabin, her flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain. The journey up the mountain was treacherous. The normally familiar trail transformed into a slippery maze of mud and fallen branches. More than once, Maya had to grab onto trees to keep from sliding backward down the slope. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and the rain had soaked through her coat within minutes, but something drove her forward. She found the cabin glowing with warm light from every window, as if Marcus had known company was coming. But when she reached the door, breathless and dripping, she discovered he wasn't inside waiting for her. The cabin was empty, though a fire crackled merrily in the stone fireplace and tools were scattered across the main room as if he'd been working on something until just moments before. Maya called his name, but only the echo of her own voice answered. It was then she noticed the papers spread across the table, detailed drawings and calculations that made her heart skip. They were plans for a new bridge, complete with precise measurements and engineering specifications that looked far too sophisticated for a simple handyman. The sketches showed a design that could withstand flooding, with innovative supports that would actually grow stronger under pressure. Maya stared at the drawings, her mind racing. This wasn't the work of someone who had stumbled into their community by chance. These plans were the creation of someone with serious engineering knowledge, someone who had been thinking about their village's problems long before tonight's crisis. A sound from outside made her look up, the rumble of an engine cutting through the storm. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see lights moving down toward the village, but they were coming from the wrong direction entirely. Maya folded the bridge plans and tucked them inside her coat, then stepped back out into the storm. The lights were clearer now. It was definitely a truck, but it was taking a route she didn't recognize, one that seemed to bypass the village entirely and head toward the creek from the east. Following the sound, she made her way through the trees until she could see the water. What she discovered there made her forget all about the cold rain soaking through her clothes. Marcus stood waist-deep in the raging creek, his truck's headlights illuminating the scene as he worked to secure some kind of temporary support structure beneath the failing bridge. He moved with purpose and expertise, as if he'd done this kind of emergency repair countless times before. But it was what he was using for materials that truly shocked her. Steel beams and industrial-grade cables that definitely hadn't come from the village's modest supply shed. This was professional equipment, the kind that required advanced planning and resources that went far beyond what any drifter should possess. Maya crept closer, staying hidden in the tree line as she watched him work. Every movement was precise, calculated. This wasn't desperation or improvisation. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The question that had been nagging at her for weeks crystallized into certainty. Marcus wasn't just hiding something about his past. He had come here for a specific reason, prepared for exactly this kind of situation. The storm that had been building all week finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain against Maya's bedroom window. She'd been lying awake for hours, turning over everything Elena had told her about the hidden room beneath the cabin. The revelation that Thomas wasn't who he claimed to be gnawed at her, mixing excitement with a growing sense of unease. Lightning illuminated her room in stark white flashes, and in one of those brief moments, she could have sworn she saw a figure moving through the trees toward the old Miller place. Maya pressed her face to the glass, waiting for the next flash, but when it came, the forest appeared empty again. Unable to shake her restlessness, she pulled on her boots and rain jacket. The sensible thing would be to wait until morning, but something about the storm felt urgent, as if it were washing away the last barriers between truth and deception. The rain was colder than expected, and by the time she reached the cabin, her teeth were chattering despite the jacket. The structure stood solid against the elements, Thomas's restoration work proving its worth as water cascaded harmlessly off the reinforced roof and properly sealed walls. Warm light glowed from the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting he was awake despite the late hour. Maya hesitated at the edge of the clearing. What exactly was she planning to do? Demand answers? Confront him about the discrepancies Elena had discovered? The rational part of her mind insisted she should return home and approach this properly in daylight, preferably with the sheriff present. But then she noticed something that made her forget all reasonable caution. The door was standing wide open, rain blowing across the threshold into the cabin's interior. No one would leave their door open in weather like this, not unless something was very wrong. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. No response came from within. Maya approached slowly, her boots squelching in the muddy ground. As she drew closer, she could see that furniture had been overturned inside. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages darkening with rainwater. She stepped across the threshold and immediately felt the wrongness of the scene. This wasn't the neat, carefully organized space she'd visited before. Someone had torn through it with systematic thoroughness, pulling out drawers, emptying shelves, even removing floorboards in several places. "Thomas?" she called again, louder this time. A groan answered her from somewhere deeper in the cabin. Maya followed the sound through the main room, past the overturned table where Thomas had shown her his architectural drawings, now scattered and ruined. The noise seemed to come from near the back wall, close to where Elena said the hidden entrance should be. She found him lying crumpled against the far wall, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment Maya thought he might be dead. But as she knelt beside him, his eyelids fluttered open. "Maya?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. What happened? Who did this to you?" Thomas tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent obvious pain through his body. "They found me," he said simply. "I knew they would, eventually." "Who found you?" "Thomas, I don't understand any of this." He looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of years. My name isn't Thomas Reed," he said quietly. "It's David Chen. I've been running for almost 2 years now." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Despite Elena's warnings, hearing the confession directly still shocked her. "Running from people who want something I took from them. Something I couldn't let them keep." David's eyes moved to a section of the wall where several boards had been pried away, revealing the dark opening beyond. "They didn't find it, though. I moved it weeks ago after I realized someone was watching the village." "Moved what?" "David, you're scaring me." Before he could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching cut through the storm. Multiple engines, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. David struggled to his feet, alarm replacing the pain in his expression. "They're coming back," he said urgently. "Maya, you need to leave, right now." "I'm not leaving you like this. You don't understand. These aren't local police. They're corporate security, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who's seen too much." The engine sounds were getting closer, and through the rain, Maya could see the first sweep of headlights cutting through the trees. David grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd just been beaten unconscious. "There's another way out," he said, pulling her toward the hidden opening in the wall. "Through here. It leads to an old mine tunnel that comes out near Copper Creek. But Maya, once you know the truth about what I'm protecting, there's no going back to your normal life. These people won't stop until they get what they want." The headlights were visible through the windows now, and Maya could hear car doors slamming despite the storm. She looked at David's battered face, then at the dark tunnel entrance that promised answers and danger in equal measure. The village hall had never held so many people at once. Bodies pressed against the walls as voices rose in heated debate, the air thick with confusion and fear. Elena stood at the front, watching faces she'd known her entire life transform with suspicion and anger. "He's been lying to us from the beginning," Marcus shouted from the back row. "How do we know anything he's told us is true?" Thomas raised his weathered hands for silence. "We need to hear his side before we make any judgments." "His side?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "My daughter trusted him, we all trusted him, and he's been hiding this massive secret the entire time." Elena felt the weight of every gaze in the room. As the one who'd spent the most time with the mysterious cabin builder, they expected her to provide answers she didn't have. The revelation of his true identity had shaken her more than anyone, yet something deep inside resisted the growing tide of suspicion. "Where is he now?" asked Mrs. Chen, clutching her grandson's hand tightly. "Still at the cabin, far as I know," Thomas replied. "But after what happened at the mine yesterday, I'm not sure he'll stay much longer." The mine incident had been the breaking point. When the century-old support beam had finally given way in the deepest tunnel, trapping 3 workers beneath tons of rubble, conventional rescue efforts had failed. The mysterious young man had appeared as if from nowhere, his hands moving with impossible precision as he manipulated the collapsed stone with techniques that defied explanation. All 3 workers had emerged without a scratch, but dozens of witnesses had seen the impossible made real. "My grandfather worked those tunnels for 40 years, called out Pete Harrison. He knew every inch, every weakness. What happened down there wasn't natural. Natural or not, those men are alive because of him," Elena found herself saying. The room turned toward her, and she felt her cheeks flush. "Isn't that what matters?" "What matters is knowing who we're dealing with," Marcus shot back. "You've seen what he can do with his bare hands. The cabin, the mine, those stories about his past that never quite add up. What if he's dangerous? Dangerous? Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. He's helped half the families in this village. Fixed roofs, mended fences, found Clara when she was lost in the storm. If he wanted to hurt anyone, don't you think he would have done it by now? An uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Elena caught Thomas's eye and saw something like approval there, but also worry. The old man had always been protective of outsiders who found their way to the village, but even his faith seemed shaken. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, and the room strained to hear her. "Yesterday evening, after what happened at the mine, I saw him walking toward the old cemetery. He stopped at the Morrison plot and just stood there for the longest time. When I got closer, I could swear I heard him talking to someone, but there was nobody there." The Morrison plot. Elena's blood ran cold. That section of the cemetery dated back to the village's founding, filled with weathered headstones bearing names from local legends and half-remembered stories. What possible connection could he have to graves that were over a century old? "We need answers," Thomas said finally. "Real ones this time. Elena, you're the only one he seems to trust completely. Would you talk to him?" Elena nodded, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. The man she thought she'd been getting to know felt like a stranger now, someone wearing a familiar face while harboring unfathomable secrets. Yet when she closed her eyes, she could still see the gentle way he'd helped Clara with her reading, the careful attention he'd paid to every detail while teaching the village children basic carpentry skills. "What if he won't tell me the truth either?" she asked. "Then we'll know where we stand," Marcus said grimly. "And we'll have to decide what to do about it." As the crowd began to disperse, Elena remained behind with Thomas and a few others. Through the hall's windows, she could see the cabin in the distance, its restored walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, a sign that its mysterious occupant was still there. "Elena," Thomas said softly, "be careful up there. I don't think he means us harm, but we're clearly dealing with something beyond our understanding. If anything feels wrong, if you sense any danger at all, come straight back." She nodded and gathered her coat. The walk to the cabin would take 20 minutes. 20 minutes to prepare for a conversation that might change everything. As she stepped out into the crisp mountain air, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that whatever truth awaited her would be far stranger than anything the village had imagined. Behind her, worried voices continued their debates, but ahead lay only silence and uncertainty. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain village crystalline under fresh snow, but the real tempest was just beginning inside the restored cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, her breath visible in the cold air, watching as Thomas carefully arranged the final pieces of what could only be described as the most elaborate puzzle she'd ever seen. The wooden artifacts he'd been carving weren't decorative at all. Each piece fit precisely into grooves carved throughout the cabin's interior walls, creating an intricate network of interconnected channels that seemed to pulse with their own inner logic. As Thomas inserted the last carved segment near the stone fireplace, Sarah heard a sound like distant singing, not quite human, not quite wind. "It's a resonance chamber," Thomas said without turning around. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "My grandfather built the original cabin around natural acoustic properties in the mountain. The village founders knew about it, used it, but the knowledge was lost when the old families scattered." Margaret appeared beside Sarah, Elena close behind. Word had spread quickly through the village about Thomas's midnight work, and now a small crowd gathered outside, their faces pressed against windows, watching something they couldn't quite understand. "Used it for what?" Elena asked, stepping inside despite Sarah's protective gesture. Thomas finally faced them, and Sarah saw exhaustion etched deep in his features. But there was something else, relief perhaps, or resignation, communication. The mountain has properties that amplify certain frequencies. With the right configuration, messages can travel hundreds of miles through the rock itself. Margaret's sharp intake of breath cut through the cabin's strange harmony. "The mining company. They're not just looking for copper, are they? They know about the resonance network. There are stations like this throughout the Appalachians, most of them destroyed or forgotten. But this one... Thomas ran his hand along one of the carved channels, and the singing sound grew stronger. This one was the hub, the central node that could reach all the others. Sarah's mind raced, connecting fragments of conversation she'd overheard, remembering the surveyor's intense interest in areas that seemed to hold no mineral wealth. They want to control it, use it for their own purposes. Industrial espionage, corporate communications, possibly worse. Thomas moved to an ornate wooden panel Sarah hadn't noticed before. But that's not why I came here. He pressed his palm against the panel, and it swung open, revealing a hollow space within the wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a journal bound in cracked brown leather. Thomas withdrew it with trembling hands. My grandfather didn't die in a mining accident. He was murdered because he refused to sell the location of this place to early corporate interests. My father spent his life gathering evidence, documenting the network, trying to protect what remained. Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He died trying to get back here, to activate the system one last time and send a warning to the other mountain communities. Elena moved closer, her young face serious beyond her years. What kind of warning? Thomas opened the journal, revealing pages covered in detailed maps, technical drawings, and dense handwriting. There are 7 active nodes left. If the mining company gains control of this hub, they can monitor communications, manipulate local economies, even coordinate the displacement of entire communities. It's not just about copper or coal anymore. It's about information, control, power. The singing from the walls intensified, and Sarah realized she could feel vibrations through the floorboards. It's working, isn't it? The system is coming online. The resonance builds slowly. Full activation takes hours, sometimes days. But once it reaches critical harmonics, Thomas looked up from the journal, meeting each of their gazes in turn. Every mountain community within a 300-mile radius will be able to hear what we send from here. Margaret stepped forward, her expression fierce. Then we send them the truth. We warn everyone about what's coming. It's dangerous, Thomas warned. Once they know the system is active, the company will move fast. They have resources, legal teams, probably worse. I've been running from them for 2 years, trying to stay ahead long enough to reach this place. Sarah felt the weight of decisions settling around them. Outside, she could see more villagers gathering, drawn by the strange sounds emanating from the cabin. Jim Peterson stood at the front of the group, his face grim but determined. Behind him, she recognized faces from the general store, the diner, families who'd lived in these mountains for generations. "We're not running," Sarah said firmly. "This is our home, our mountain." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "Then we send the message tonight. But everyone needs to understand. After this, there's no going back. We'll be committed to a fight that's bigger than just saving one village." The resonance grew stronger, the cabin itself seeming to breathe with ancient purpose. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, Margaret's determined scowl, Elena's bright courage, Thomas's quiet resolve. Outside, the mountain waited, its secrets finally ready to speak. The storm that had been brewing all week finally broke, just as Elena reached the cabin. Rain lashed against the windows with supernatural fury, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive and angry. She pounded on the door, her fist echoing against the solid wood that Marcus had so carefully restored. When he opened it, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. "Elena, you shouldn't be here. Not tonight. The whole village is talking." She pushed past him into the warmth of the cabin. "Mrs. Chen's arthritis disappeared completely after touching your porch railing. Tommy Morrison's stuttering stopped after he helped you carry lumber. And Sarah's baby, the doctors said her fever was life-threatening, but after you visited yesterday, she's perfectly healthy." Marcus closed the door slowly, his back to her. Coincidences. Coincidences? Elena spun around. The entire Riverside family's financial troubles vanished when they found that envelope of cash under their doormat. The same day you asked me about their situation, And the water quality in the village well has been crystal clear ever since you accidentally dropped your hammer down there 2 weeks ago. Thunder crashed overhead, and for a moment the lights flickered. In the brief darkness, Elena could have sworn she saw something, a golden shimmer around Marcus's silhouette. "You want the truth?" His voice was barely audible over the storm. "I don't know if you can handle it. Try me." He turned around, and she gasped. His eyes were different, not just their usual warm brown, but shot through with threads of gold that seemed to pulse with their own light. The carefully controlled mask he'd worn for months was finally slipping. "I didn't choose this place randomly, Elena. I was sent here." "Sent by who?" "That's complicated." He ran his hands through his hair, and she noticed his fingers were trembling. "There are places in the world where the fabric between what is and what could be grows thin. Your village sits on one of those places. It's why the original settlers thrived here, why the cabin has stood for over a century despite everything that should have destroyed it." Elena's mind raced. The stories the elders tell about the founder, Jacob Riverside, and his miraculous harvests, the way the mountain protected the village during the war, all true. But the connection was weakening. The village was dying, not just economically, but spiritually. The very essence that made this place special was fading. Marcus moved to the window, staring out at the raging storm. "I was sent to restore it." "Sent by who?" she repeated. "Others like me. We're called custodians. We find places where the extraordinary intersects with the ordinary, and we tend them." The rain seemed to intensify, drumming against the roof with increasing urgency. Elena felt the truth of his words resonate in her bones, even as her rational mind rebelled. "The cabin," she whispered. "It's not just a restoration project. It's a focal point. Every board I replaced, every stone I reset, I was weaving the connections back together, strengthening the bond between this place and the power that flows through it." He turned back to her, and she saw centuries of weariness in his eyes. "The healing, the miracles, they're not coming from me. I'm just opening the channels." Elena sank into one of the chairs he'd built with his own hands. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough to know that this village is special. Most places I work, I restore the balance and move on. But here," his voice grew soft, "here, I found something I never expected to find." "What?" "Home. You. A reason to want to stay instead of just complete the work and disappear." Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark detail, and Elena saw it with new eyes. The precise placement of every beam, the symbols carved so subtly into the woodwork that they looked like natural grain patterns, the way the entire structure seemed to pulse with quiet energy. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you have a choice." Marcus knelt beside her chair. "I've told you the truth. You can walk away, and in the morning this will all seem like a strange dream brought on by storm winds and imagination. Or you can stay and become part of something larger than either of us understood before tonight." The storm reached its crescendo, and then, quite suddenly, began to quiet. Through the windows, Elena could see the first stars breaking through the clouds. "The others like you," she said. "Will they let you stay?" "That depends on whether the village still needs a custodian, or if it needs something else." His hand found hers, someone to share the responsibility, someone born here with roots that run as deep as the mountain itself. Elena looked around the cabin one more time, really looked at it. She could feel something now, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Power, purpose, possibility. "Teach me," she said. The morning light filtered through Sarah's kitchen window as she stared at the newspaper clipping Tom had brought her. The photograph was grainy, black and white, but there was no mistaking the face. A younger version of Daniel stood beside an older man in front of what appeared to be a construction site, the caption reading, "Architectural Dynasty Continues. Marcus Thorne and Son break ground on Seattle Cultural Center." "Marcus Thorne," Sarah whispered, her coffee growing cold in her hands. "The Marcus Thorne who designed half the buildings in the Pacific Northwest." Tom nodded grimly from across her kitchen table. "And Daniel Thorne, his son, who was supposed to inherit the empire. until he vanished 3 years ago, right after his father's death. The pieces began clicking into place like the intricate joinery Daniel had used on the cabin, the impossibly precise measurements, the way he seemed to understand the original builder's intentions, the sadness that lingered behind his eyes whenever someone mentioned the past. "But why here?" Sarah asked. "Why our village?" Before Tom could answer, Martha's voice called from the front porch. "Sarah, dear, you need to see this." They found Martha standing at the porch railing, pointing toward the cabin. Even from this distance, they could see people gathered around it, not just villagers but strangers with cameras and notebooks. "Reporters," Tom muttered. Somehow they found him. Sarah's heart clenched as they hurried down the mountain path. The peaceful sanctuary Daniel had created was about to be shattered, and she could see him standing rigid near the cabin's entrance, his face pale as he faced a small crowd of journalists. "Mr. Thorne," a woman with a microphone was saying as they approached, "is it true you've been hiding here for 3 years? Your former business partners have been looking for you. There are questions about the Riverside project collapse." No comment. Daniel's voice was barely audible. "But the families who lost their homes when the foundation failed, don't they deserve answers? Your father's reputation—" "That's enough," Sarah interrupted, pushing through the crowd. She positioned herself between Daniel and the reporters, her protective instincts flaring. "This is private property." The reporter turned her attention to Sarah. "Are you aware that the man you've been harboring is wanted for questioning in one of Seattle's biggest construction scandals? The Riverside project was his design, and when it failed—" "I said that's enough." Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years mediating village disputes. "You're trespassing." But the damage was done. She could see it in Daniel's face, the careful walls he'd built around himself crumbling like poorly mortared stone. He looked at her with something approaching betrayal, as if she'd known all along who he really was. "Daniel," she started, but he was already backing toward the cabin. "How did they find me?" he asked, his voice hollow. Old Henrik stepped forward from where he'd been listening at the edge of the crowd. "Boy, whatever happened before? Look at what you've done here. Look at what you've given us." "You don't understand." Daniel's hands shook as he gestured toward the cabin. "Everything I touch falls apart. That's what I am. Someone who destroys things, not someone who builds them." The reporters pressed closer, sensing vulnerability. Sarah caught Tom's eye and nodded toward them. Understanding immediately, he began herding the journalists away from the cabin, using his considerable presence to clear the area. "That project in Seattle," Daniel continued, his words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. "It was supposed to be my masterpiece. Affordable housing for families who needed it most. But I missed something in the soil analysis. Cut corners on the foundation to meet the budget. 30 families lost everything when the building shifted." Sarah reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "My father spent his whole life building a reputation for excellence, for buildings that would last generations. And I destroyed it all in one project. When he died knowing what I'd done," Daniel's voice broke, "I couldn't face fixing it. I couldn't face anything. So—" "You came here," Sarah said softly. "I came here to disappear, to find something so broken that it couldn't be made worse." He looked at the cabin, its restored walls gleaming in the morning sun. But this place, working with wood that held memories, following techniques that had lasted a century, it felt like redemption. Martha, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Child, some things break so they can be rebuilt stronger. Your grandfather would have understood that." Daniel looked up sharply. "My grandfather? Jonas Thorne built this cabin in 1923. I've been waiting 60 years for his grandson to come home and fix it properly." Martha's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a secret finally revealed. "Though you took your sweet time about it, the silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind moving through the restored cabin's perfectly fitted boards. The morning sun cast long shadows through the rebuilt cabin's windows as Elena stood at the threshold. her hands trembling slightly as she held the worn leather journal Marcus had given her. Inside, his careful handwriting revealed everything: the real reason he'd come to their mountain village, the truth about his identity, and the devastating secret the cabin had kept buried for nearly a century. Behind her, the villagers gathered in hushed clusters, their faces a mixture of anticipation and fear. Word had spread quickly through the settlement that Marcus had something to tell them, something that would explain the strange phenomena they'd witnessed during the cabin's reconstruction, the way ancient tools had appeared overnight, the impossibly perfect restoration of details no living person should have known, and the dreams that had begun visiting the older residents, dreams filled with faces they'd never seen but somehow recognized. Marcus emerged from the cabin's interior, carrying a small wooden box that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of vulnerability, and Elena noticed how his hands shook as he set the box on the porch railing. "My great-grandfather disappeared in these mountains in 1924, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. "Samuel Hartwell. The official records say he was a surveyor, but that wasn't the whole truth. He was searching for something that had been hidden here, something that belonged to my family, for generations before it was stolen." Old Henrik stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face creased with recognition. "Hartwell. I know that name. My grandmother used to tell stories about a man who came looking for the heart of the mountain, said he went mad, claimed the trees were whispering to him." Marcus nodded grimly. The whispers weren't madness, they were memories, trapped in the very foundation of this place. When the original cabin was built, it wasn't just constructed, it was consecrated. The builders knew they were creating more than shelter. They were creating a repository. Elena felt the journal's pages flutter in the mountain breeze, and she caught a glimpse of detailed sketches, architectural drawings that perfectly matched the cabin's restored interior, down to the placement of every beam and stone. "You knew exactly how to rebuild it because you had the original plans," she whispered. "More than plans," Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the wooden box. "My family were the keepers of stories, Elena. For centuries we preserved the oral histories of dozens of mountain communities like this one. We carried their memories, their traditions, their secrets. But in 1924, everything my great-grandfather had collected was hidden here when he realized he was being hunted." The crowd murmured uneasily, and Maria Delacroix pushed through to the front. "Hunted by whom?" "People who believed that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, who thought that the old ways, the old stories, should die with the people who lived them." Marcus's voice grew heavy with generations of pain. "My great-grandfather hid everything in the cabin's foundation before he fled deeper into the mountains. He was never seen again." With careful hands, Marcus opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay dozens of small objects: carved stones, pressed flowers, tiny scrolls of paper, and items Elena couldn't immediately identify. Each seemed to hum with its own energy, as if awakening after decades of slumber. "Every family in this village has ancestors whose stories are preserved here," Marcus continued. "The Kowalski family's arrival after the war, the Delacroix mining claims that saved the village during the Depression, Henrik's grandfather's weather predictions that prevented countless disasters, all of it documented and protected." As he spoke, Henrik stumbled backward, his eyes wide. "The dreams," he gasped. "I've been seeing my grandfather in my dreams every night since you started rebuilding. He's been trying to tell me something about the old mine shaft, warning me about a cave-in that's coming." Other villagers began speaking up, their voices overlapping in excitement and fear. Dreams of departed relatives, sudden knowledge of family recipes thought lost forever, an inexplicable understanding of seasonal patterns their grandparents had known, but never passed down. Elena realized the profound weight of what Marcus had accomplished. By rebuilding the cabin exactly as it had been, he'd not only restored a building, he'd reopened a doorway to their collective past. "But why now?" she asked. "Why did you wait so long to come back for this?" Marcus looked at each villager in turn, and Elena saw the deep loneliness that had driven him to their remote corner of the world. "Because I'm the last keeper," he said quietly. "When I die, all of this knowledge dies with me unless I can find others willing to carry it forward. I came here hoping to give your histories back to you, but I stayed because I discovered something I'd never had before." He paused, his gaze settling on Elena's face with unmistakable tenderness. "I found home." The mountain wind stirred through the pines, and for a moment Elena could swear she heard whispers in the rustling branches, voices of the past welcoming them into an ancient circle of memory and trust. The morning mist clung to the valley as the entire village gathered around the restored cabin, their faces a mixture of wonder and anticipation. Thomas stood on the porch, no longer the mysterious stranger who had arrived 6 months ago, but not quite the simple craftsman he had pretended to be either. "My real name is Thomas Whitmore," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "My great-great-grandfather built this cabin in 1923, but that's only part of the story." Sarah stepped closer, her hand finding his. Over the past weeks, as the truth had slowly emerged, she had come to understand that the man she'd fallen for was both more complex and more genuine than she'd ever imagined. "Elias Whitmore wasn't just a settler," Thomas continued. "He was a cartographer and engineer who discovered something remarkable about this valley. The geological formations here create a unique acoustic and electromagnetic environment. He built the cabin as more than a home. It was designed as a resonance chamber." Old Henrik pushed forward, his weathered face creased with confusion. "Resonance chamber? What kind of nonsense is that?" Thomas smiled gently. "Henrik, remember how your arthritis disappeared after helping with the foundation work? And Martha, your migraine stopped after we raised the walls. The cabin's structure, built with specific proportions and materials, amplifies the natural healing properties of this place." Dr. Rebecca Chen, who had driven up from the city to witness this revelation, nodded thoughtfully. "I've been studying the medical reports from the valley over the past 6 months. The improvement in chronic conditions among residents is statistically impossible to explain through conventional means." The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others beginning to piece together their own experiences. Emma Rodriguez felt the weight of her camera, having documented each step of the restoration without realizing she was recording something far more significant than a simple renovation. "But why the secrecy?" Mayor Johnson demanded. "Why not tell us from the beginning?" Thomas's expression grew somber. "Because my family has been protecting this secret for a century. When my great-great-grandfather died, he left behind journals and blueprints, but also warnings. He wrote about people who would exploit this place, who would turn it into a commercial venture or worse, destroy it, trying to replicate its effects elsewhere." He gestured toward the cabin's carefully restored beams and stone foundation. "Every measurement matters. The angle of the roof, the spacing of the support posts, the mineral composition of the stones, it all works together. But only here, in this specific location." Sarah squeezed his hand. "So you've been the guardian of this place?" "My family has been, yes. We've taken turns over the decades, always watching from a distance. But the cabin was deteriorating faster than we anticipated. I'm a structural engineer in my regular life, so I volunteered to come here and either save it or—" He paused, the weight of that alternative heavy in his voice. "Or ensure its secrets died with it." Young Peter, who had spent countless hours helping with the restoration, stepped forward. "But you didn't destroy it. You saved it. Does that mean we can stay? That the village won't die?" Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him. People who had become more than neighbors, who had become family. "That's not my decision alone. This place, these effects, they belong to all of you now. You've all contributed to its restoration, put your own energy and hope into these walls." Elena Vasquez, the local historian, spoke up from the back of the crowd. "I've been researching the old records. There are stories going back generations about this valley, about people living longer, healing faster. We always thought they were just folklore." "They weren't," Thomas confirmed. "But they were also never meant to be secrets kept from the people who lived here. My great-great-grandfather's fears made my family too cautious. You all proved that. Dr. Chen stepped forward with a tablet in her hands. I've been in contact with the university. They want to study this phenomenon properly, but with the village's consent and involvement, this could become a research center for natural healing environments. It would bring sustainable income to the community while preserving what makes this place special. The crowd erupted in excited conversations. Henrik found himself standing next to Martha, both of them unconsciously noting how much better they'd felt these past months. The Rodriguez family exchanged glances, recognizing that their decision to stay might have been guided by more than just stubbornness. As the discussions swirled around them, Thomas and Sarah found themselves in a pocket of relative quiet on the porch. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do you stay? Do you go back to your old life?" Thomas looked out over the valley that had become his home, at the people who had become his family. "I think my old life ended the day I decided to save this place instead of letting it fall. The question is whether there's room in this new life for an engineer who's also a guardian, for someone who's learned that the most important structures we build are the communities we create." Sarah smiled, understanding finally that some mysteries were worth preserving and some secrets were worth sharing with the right people.